We're on the top of Samach Zayin Amud Beis, and we're trying to bring a biblical source for a heter hana, according to one opinion, with regard to the limbs of the soyer after it was sent over the cliff. Dichsiv, the pasuk says in Achrimos, "V'shilach es hasoyer ba'midbar." Now, the midbar is always a metaphor for hefker, for something that's ownerless. Anyone could come along and benefit from it. And since the Torah has already said in an earlier pasuk that the soyer has to be sent hamidbara, towards the wilderness, why did the Torah again have to repeat a second time, V'shilach es hasoyer ba'midbar? Unless the pasuk is telling me that the status of the Avarim is that of Hefker Kimidbar. Uman Diyomar Asurim. And according to the other Man Diyomar who says that it's Asur Ba'na, Tichsiv, the pasuk says, V'nasa Sa'ir Alav Es Kol Avonam El Eretz Gzeira. Gzeira is an enactment, which is a chumrah, a stringency. And it indicates that something is forbidden. And that means that the Avarim, the various limbs of the soyer, are asurim ba'no. And I'm sure there's a deeper fundamental machlokus. It's not just a question of which pasuk, but it has to do with the status of the soyer after nasis mitzvos. But mandi omer asurim. Now, if you're going to go to second mandi omer, hi midbar my ovidle, we said that there was an extra pasuk midbar, which taught me that it's hefker and mutabana. And now the Bryce is going to tell us that the word midbar in this context is written thrice. First, it says l'shalech osol azazel hamidbara, and that's in pasuk Yud in Perek Zayin. Then it says v'shilach b'yad ish iti hamidbara. That's in pasuk Chaf Aleph. And finally, v'shilach es hasoyer ba'midbar in pasuk Chaf Beis. Why do we need these three psukim that repeat the word midbar 3 times? And the answer is l'rabos, 3 different bate mikdashos, or what we would call mishkanos, that also require on Yom Kippur shiluach sar hamidbara. And the ribui is from the extra words ba'midbar or midbara 3 times. And that's number 1, no v'givon. No v'givon, we'll talk about in a second, had a similar status. So that's 1 Mishkan. And then we have Shiloh. And then we have Beis Olamim, the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. All these 3 require Shiluach Lazazah. Now, when Bnei Yisrael crossed the Jordan and entered into Eretz Yisrael, they set up the Mishkan in a place called Gilgal. And that's where the Mishkan was for a period of 12 years. And during that 12-year period, they were busy, preoccupied with conquering the land, dividing up the land into territories for the Shvatim. And at that point, there was a heter bamos, and you were allowed to set up your own private altar and be makriv your own korbanos. After they conquered the land and they completed the process of divvying up the land, they came to a place called Shiloh, and there they built a stone building. They covered it with urios, with curtains on top, and that's where it stood for 369 years. And at that point, during that period of 360, there was no heter bamos. Then at the time of Eli HaKohen, there was a churban of Shiloh. We mentioned it on Tisha B'Av and Akinos. And the Aron was taken captivity by the Plishtim. Then they came to a place called Nov, and there they built a Migdash. And when Shaul destroyed the city of Nov, because they fed David HaMelech, then they came to a place called Givon, and they reestablished the Migdash there. And that's where they were, and that's where the Migdash stood until Shlomo Melech built the Beis HaMikdash, Beis Olamim, B'Yerushalayim. Now, even though there are 4 places here, as we said before, and we only have 3 psukim, But the answer is that no Vigimon is considered like one. They have the exact same dinim. And during that period of time, there was, of Nov and Gimel, there was a heter bamos for Yachid. As far as Shiloh and Beis Olam is concerned, why do we need a pasuk for each one of them? And the answer is because they're not similar and they're different one from the other. Shiloh was, as we said before, a structure of walls that were made of stone, and Urios as a roof. And it was a little bit like a Mishkan. Beis Hamikdash had not only stone, but also had a roof that was made of stone. And it didn't look like a Mishkan at all. It looked like a Beis Hamikdash. Not sure why the Gemara feels they need a pasuk for the Beis Hamikdash. I mean, I know it's different than Shiloh, but I guess the pasuk is telling you all situations in which you send the sire out to the midbar. Now, according to the other Mandim, who says that the Avarim, after the sire is sent off the tzuk, are mutarim ba'adna, so high gzera ma'ovidle, what does he derive from the pasuk gzera, which we said meant that it was a gzera like a chumra di surah? And the answer is, Miboile, he uses it l'chasadya, as the Bryce says, gzera ein gzera l'chatucha. Chatucha means that the cliff has to be very sharp. It can't have a slope. That's called in Hebrew gozur v'chatuch. So it's not that slope, gradual slope like other mountains, but rather it's a steep cliff. Davar Achar, another possible interpretation of Gzera, Ein Gzera l'davar hamizgazer v'yored. In other words, the sa'ir should be cut into a varim. So the first shot was that we're looking for a tzuk that is very steep, and the second interpretation of the word Gzera is that the segments and the limbs of the body should be cut. Davar Acher. Now he has a third interpretation of the word Gzera. Shema Tomar Masechet Tohu. We have what's called mishpatim, that are rational laws, and then we have Gzeros or chukim. Those are statutes that we can't explain. And this case of Tzara Mishtalech, sending it over the tzuk, is another example of a gzera. Gzera meaning a chok that we cannot understand. And people might come to say, Masechet Tohu. It's a meaningless ritual to send it over the tzuk. And therefore, Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, it's gzera, ani Hashem. Ani Hashem gzartiv, gzera gzartiv. It's a chok. Ein lecha reshus lahar bohen. And therefore, the Torah calls it Eretz Gzera. It's a Gzeras HaKosuv. You don't have permission to start thinking, well, I don't understand. Rava sides with that Mandiyama who says that you're allowed to benefit. Lo Omer Torah shaleach l'takol. The Torah would not command us in the midst of shiluach, and it might create a takola, meaning that after you send the sire off the cliff, somebody inadvertently, not knowing that this was the sire lazazel, might come and benefit from the segments and the limbs of its broken body. That's a takola. We want to avoid that, and therefore the Torah says it's mutar ba'no. No one who will take these segments of the body and use it for his purposes, even to feed his dog, will be violating any isur whatsoever. Tan Rabbanon, Azazel, shehei az v'kosher. The Gemara quotes a brisa that is splitting the word Azazel right down the middle, and you read it Azaz El, but it's not really down the middle because we took the aleph before the second Zion, right? There are two Zions in Azazel, and we put the two Zions together and then push the aleph towards the end of the word. So we have Azaz, which is power, El, which is might, or alternatively, Azaz refers to the A's, meaning to the goat itself, and El means it's very powerful. And the Mefarshim here, Ramban and others, they quote a pasuk that we're familiar with in Tehillim Chaf Daled. It says Izuz Vigibar, so that the word Azaz means Izuz, which also means powerful. Yachol, the Bryce says, I might think that the place from which we will send off the soya, push it off, is B'Yishuv. It's in an urban area, Talmud Lomar, Bamidbar. Bamidbar means it's out there in the wilderness where nobody's around, nobody lives there. Now the Bryce says, Uminayin Shebitzuk. How do we know that you have to push the Sawyer? You have to choose the right mountain, and it's got to be a mountain that's a tzuk. A tzuk means it's almost vertical, it's steep, it's a cliff. Almiloma Gzera. Gzera means that the mountain itself is cut. I don't know if you've ever been to Gibraltar, the Rock of Gibraltar. It's an amazing sight because it's simply a vertical mountain that goes very, very high up. Tanya Idach, we learned in a different brisa, Azazel is Kasha Shebaharit. It's the strong mountain. And once again, we're using the word Azazel as Azaz El. And El means something Yeshbo Koshi. It's very powerful. The Chen Hu Omer, and we also have a pasuk in Yechezkel, Perek Yud Zayin, V'es Ele Haaretz Lokach. Here, Yechezkel is prophesying about the king of Bavel, who's going to come, and he's going to take with chazka, with power, he's going to take over the land. And it's not just the land itself, but chozka, those who are the strong ones in the land, meaning the officers. So we see that the word El means strong. Chazak v'kasher. Tana debei Rabbi Shmuel, Azazel shemechaper al maisa uza ve'azael. Now, amongst the various sins which the Sarah Mishtalech is mechaper, there's one particular sin that's singled out, and that is the sin of Gili Arayos, a sexual violation. And the Lashon Azazel is an allusion to Uza Vazoel. These were the two mighty angels. They were destructive angels that came down to the land during the time of Nama. She was the sister of Tuval Cain, and they sinned with the sin of Gili Arayos. Even the angels, when they took on a human form, were not able to overcome their Yetzer Hara for Arayos. And again, why would Arayos be singled out? I'm not sure. I suspect that Arayos is the most powerful of any Yetzer. And the proof is in the fact that these guys, Usa and Azael, were celestial angels, and yet they sinned and they fell prey to the temptation of Arayos. So we need a special Maisa Hamachaper for those kind of Averos. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa. The Torah says in Vayikra Yudches, Es Mishpatai Ta'asu. Now, Mishpatai are rational laws. Dvarim shel mole nichtavu dinuchi kosvu. Even had they not been written in the Torah as an explicit mandate, we would have derived them anyway, and we would have fulfilled them because they are logical and rational. Fi elu hein, we'll give you some examples of mishpatim. Avodas kochavim, to worship an idol. Certainly, we would not even dream of worshiping an idol. We only worship God. Gili Arayos, which means, I'm not sure if it means incest, more likely it means adultery with a married woman. This is something logical. Even in the West, there are certain prohibitions. Again, they're going in the opposite direction these days, but shvichas damim, murder, gezel, stealing someone else's money. Ubirchas Hashem. Birchas Hashem is a euphemism for makalal es Hashem, for somebody who chas v'sholem curses. All of the above are mishpatim because the logic of a person, the rational faculty, will understand these laws. I know you're a judge, so you'll know what I mean. Es chukosai tishmoru. Now the pasuk continues and speaks about chukim. Dvarim, these are laws shahasatan meshiv aleihem, that the Satan, which probably represents the other nations, or perhaps the apikoros within us, meshiv aleihem means they say, what's going on over here? Why are you doing these ritual acts? What meaning could it have? There's no rational explanation for it. And really what these mitzvos are gzeras hamelech. This is the decree of the King of Kings. We cannot understand them. The Eluhin, and let's give you some examples. Achilas chazir. I never tasted bacon, but I was told that amongst the goyim, bacon is a whole industry. Levisha shadnes. I mean, you can't wear a beged that has woven wool and linen together. What sense does that make? Alitzas Yevama, that if a woman became a widow and her husband left no children and he has living brothers, and she needs chalitza, she can't marry anyone else without chalitza. The whole ritual of chalitza defies rational explanation. Taras hamitzora, and we're talking about negoyim, and in the case of mitzora, so many complicated laws in mitzora. And we could also add the paraduma, this week's parsha. Sure enough, our case, our sugya is right here on the list. Shemet Tomar, maybe something inside of you, or perhaps some external adversary will say to you, Masechet tohem, these are meaningless acts. Talmud Lomar, Ani Hashem chakaktiv. I am the Lord, the Almighty, and I have decreed these laws. You have no permission to start thinking, oh, it makes no sense, we could do with that. The Mishnah recorded two opinions at what point in time the Torah says, is it, as the Tanakh would have it, immediately when he exits Yerushalayim, or Rabbi Shimon when he pushes it off the tzuk? Those who accompany the Mishalech on his route, on his journey, and they go from Yerushalayim till the tzuk, again, different people who are manning the various sukkos, they don't have this law of Matam Begodim. I don't know what the Havamina was, but I might think that he hasn't even exited Yerushalayim. He just left the Azara and he's holding on to the Soyer. He's already Matam Begodim. Tamalomar ha-mishalech. And the language of mishalech means when he is functioning as a shliach. And he's on his way to the desert. Then he's Matam Begodim, but not before he leaves Yerushalayim. I might entertain the possibility to have to wait all the way and postpone his Tumas Begodim until he reaches the precipice. The extra vav is a ribui. And that's going to teach me that at the beginning of his shlichus, he's already Matami Begodim. Okay, so how do I reconcile this? On the one hand, the pasuk seems to indicate that he is a mishalech, and that would mean Achiagia Litzuk. On the other hand, it says Veha Mishalech as a ribui, that immediately it's Matami Begodim. So how do we reconcile this? Mishayete chutz lechomas Yerushalayim. As soon as he leaves the walls that surround Yerushalayim, he's metam begodim, and then it's considered mishaleach asar lazazil, even though he hasn't yet reached to the tzuk. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi Omer, azazel v'chibes. There is a smichus between the word azazel and v'chibes. V'chicha is begodov, and that teaches me ad she'giya l'tzuk. This is Rabbi Yossi's middle view, that it's when the Mishalech reaches the tzuk, he hasn't yet pushed it off the mountain, then he's metame his begodim, and that's called azazel v'chibes. Rav Shimon Omer, hamshalech sol azol yichavis begodim, zarko bevas rosh, and v'metame begodim. When he sends the head, right? We said the soy is backwards, right? But as soon as he sends the head out, at that point he's mekame god. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's the dechifa lebazazil, that is his shilucha. That is what it means that he has fulfilled his shlichus, and at that point, and not earlier, he's metame god. And now we're up to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Samach Zayin Omid Beis. And the Mishnah is going to continue our discussion that we sort of got a little bit distracted from when we talked about the Sawyer, but we're going back to the Avodas Yom Kippurim of the Kohen Gadol. And after the Kohen Gadol has given over the Sawyer to the Mishaleach, Bolo, Eitzel, Par V'Sar HaNisrafim. He now comes on the Par and the Sawyer that were burnt, that have to be burnt. And he had left the Par V'Sar after the Azos Hadam in the Kodesh Kadoshim and in the Heichal. And like any chatos, these two karbonos, the par and the soyer, have to have their imurim burnt on the mizbeach hachitzon. However, there's a difference between these chatos offerings, because as far as the generic chatos offering, the basar is eaten by zichrei kahuna. Here, the basar is not going to be eaten. It has to be burnt in a place outside of Yerushalayim. But first, we have to burn the imurim like any chatos on the mizbeach hachitzon. Is therefore hotzi as emureim. He took out the emurim, and he was makriv them on the mizbeach. But first, nisanam b'megis. He places them into a bowl, a kara, which is a kli shares. And then hiktirun al gabi mizbeach hachitzon, and then he would burn it on the outer mizbeach. Now, just to mention, karos in Aramaic is megasta. Now, the problem with this Mishnah of Nasnan b'megis, it seems to imply that he put the emurim into one megis. Now he's taking emurim from both the par and the soyer, and he's putting them both into one bowl. The Gemara says in Menachos, "Ein ma'arvim chalavim v'chalavim." So there's an answer in the name of the Mikdash David that it's possible that since they were ma'arev, the dam of the par and the dam of the soyer, therefore the par and the soyer are considered like one carbon, and we can be ma'arev, we can combine their emurim. Now the Mishnah says that after he tore open kra'an v'hotias emureim, and he gave it over, and he put it in a bowl, and now it was burnt on the mizbeach, kran b'makolos. Now, we're talking about limbs of the dead par and the dead sawyer. Limbs. I mean, as far as the emurim is concerned, that we took out and we burnt on the mizbeach. But what about the limbs of the par v'sawyer? Kla'on b'maklos. He intertwined them into braids, and the limbs of the bull were intertwined with the limbs of the goat, of the sawyer. The two animals were strung onto two poles, carried by 4 people, walking 2 abreast. And at this point, the animals were still whole, except for those places where the emurim had been removed. Votzi on the beis hasreifa, and now they took him out to a maracha that was outside Yerushalayim. And again, it wasn't the Kohen Gadol who took them there, but it was other Kohen. And from what moment in time the Torah says that whoever is soref as a par and as a soy becomes tameh. So I'll read to you the pasuk. It says, "Vasoref osam yichabes begodav v'rochatz b'sar b'mayim." So at what point is the tumas begodim activated? Mishayetze chutz lechomas hazor. As soon as those who are taking the limbs out for burning in the Beis HaSreifa outside of the Mikdash, as soon as they leave the Azara, at that point, they're already mitame begodim. And the Gemara later on is going to derive this from a pasuk, from a limud. Now, in the footnote here, he quotes the Chafetz Chaim, who, as you know, authored a work on Kodshim, which is called Likutei Halachos. And the Chafetz Chaim has a suffix. What do the Chacham have in mind here? Ha'otzah b'fol goremes hatuma. Is it that the moment that they take out the limbs, that's what causes tumah? O shenesias haparim l'chutz lamachnos goremes hatuma. Or it's only when they carry the parim out of the machna, that's when tumah is generated. Nafkaminam echad lo hotzi me'azara el rak nasa b'derech. There was one person who took the limbs out of the azor, another person carried them out to the Beis HaSreifa. Is the second person tameh as well? And another suffix, mashamotzion, those who take out the limbs to the Beis HaSreifa at Yerushalayim, mitame begodim, who mishum shemesayel l'sreifa. It's because they are part of the Sreifa. They're helping this Chadish B'Torah, Shasiyua L'Sreifa, is Mascheles Kvar Be'otzah Me Hazora, O Shituma Chadosha Shechit Torah, Shehamotzias HaParim Nitmu. And Rabbi Shimon Omer, Mishiyatzis Ha'or Beruban. It's only when the burning process reaches rov, that rov basar parvas soy are burnt, then the tumah is generated. Now, we learned in our Mishnah that after they ripped out the emurim, they put them into a megis, and they were maktir on the mizbeach. And it sounds like that immediately after they put it into this bowl, they would be maktir al gabi mizbeach. So the Gemara asks, Viktiron salkedaitov? Are you telling me that now he burns the emurim? The zman of haktoras emurim was later on, when the Kohen Gadol would wear his big day zav, and he was makriv the musafim. More answers Ela Ema. This is the way we have to interpret the Mishnah. That laktir al gabi mizbeach, he placed them in the megas in order to be maktir them in the mizbeach, but not now. When the time comes after the Kohen Gadol is makriv the musaf and he's wearing his big day zah. So the Gemara now explains what does it mean that he intertwined them into braids. Rabbi Yochanan kimin clear, like a braid. So exactly what Rabbi Yochanan is adding to our Mishnah, we're not sure. Any event, Tana we learned in a Brisa, Lo haya minatchan, he didn't cut them, nituach besar ola. In other words, the soref, the person who's in charge of burning these limbs, would surgically cut the par and the sar levarim, but loya menatchan nituach b'bsar ola. In other words, in a case of a b'sar ola, they were mafshit mina or, they ripped and separated the basar from the or, from the hide itself, before they did this cutting up the basar into pieces. Ella od al gabi basar. In other words, they would cut up the avarim even as the or was still attached to the basar. They didn't separate the or from the basar. So the Gemara asks me, Nani Mili, how do we know this, that with regard to the mitzvah of Sreifas Hapar Vasar, they would do the menatchin, but without mafshitin, and it was different than a carbon ola. And the answers to Sanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rebbe Omer Nemar Khan in the Parsha of Akrovas Parvasar Yom Kippurim, it says Or Ubasar V'Peresh. It says V'Sarfu Be'eshas O Rasam V'Saram V'Pirsham. V'Nemar Lahalon, with regard to the par of the Kohen Mashiach, it says Or Ubasar Uperesh. The pasuk reads V'Yes Or Habasar V'Eskol B'Saro Al Rosho V'Al Kra'ov V'Kirbo Upirsho. And the Gemara derives here on the top of Samaches Malahalan in the case of Par Kohen Mashiach, the burning Al Yidei Nituach V'Lo Yidei Hefshed Or. In other words, immediately after they cut up the Avarim, they did the Sreifa. They didn't wait till Hefshed Or until they took off the skins. Afkan here too, with regard to the Sawyer of Yom Kippurim, the Sreifa was Al Yidei Nituach V'Lo Yidei Hefshed Or. They didn't take off the skin. So Gemara asks for Hasam in Par Melch Mashiach Minolan. How do you know that in Par Mashiach, which requires Sreifa, and the Soref has to be Menateach, he has to do a Nituch of the Avarim, but he will not remove the Or? How do you know such a thing? The Sanya, we learned in a Brisa, it says in the Torah with regard to Hotas Par Kohen Mashiach L'Sreifa, and Vayikra Yud Perik Dalit, the Es Or HaBasar V'Eskol B'Saro Al Rosho V'Al Bikirbo Upersho, and then V'Hotzi Es Kol Aparel Michutz L'Mafim V'Sar Fosal Eitzim Ba'esh Melamed Shemotzio, he takes the power out for Sreifa Kishu Sholem V'Eno Menatcho Kodem Otza, and he adds here in the Masifta Sharei Im Yeh Minutach Hech Yochel Lahotzi Es Kol HaOmer B'Pasuk B'Pamachas. And this is going to be the source from which we derive that with regard to the power of the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Mashiach, the halacha is that the Sreifa will follow the Nituach Avarim without Hefshet. Okay, then so here is where we're going to stop. on the top of Samach Ches Amud Aleph. Wishing you a great day.